Spring 339. The air in Seleucia Ctesiphon hangs thick with the scent of the Tigris mud and silt, baked under a relentless sun that turns the river's edge to cracked clay. You stand among the throng outside the royal audience hall, your sandals sinking into the dust churned by 1,000-feet merchants from the Gulf ports, Zoroastrian priests in white robes starched with starch and sanctity, Aramaic-speaking scribes clutching wax tablets like shields. The murmur rises a low hum of Aramaic and Pahlavi, laced with the sharp tang of unwashed bodies and incense from the fire temples nearby. Then it shifts a collective intake, as if the crowd has forgotten to breathe. Horns blare from the palace gates, brass echoing off mud brick walls that have stood since Alexander's shadow fell here. The sound drills into your skull, vibrating through your ribs. You push forward, elbowing past a woman, clutching a child to her chest, her eyes wide with the fear that has no name yet. The gates grind open on iron hinges that screech like damned souls, revealing the inner court courtiers in silk tunics embroidered with lions and flames their faces painted with coal to ward off the evil eye. At the center on a dais of lapis and gold sits the figure who has summoned you. All Shapur, King of Kings, his diadem glinting like a blade in the light. He is young, barely 30, but his gaze cuts through the assembly like a scimitar through silk. It lands on the cluster of men at the 4 bishops in rough wool tunics, their crosses hidden beneath cloaks, deacons with ink-stained fingers from copying scriptures by lamplight. One steps forward, Shemዖn bar Sabbaʿe Catholicos of the Eastern Church, his beard streaked with gray, his frame bent but unbowed. The king's lips curl not in smile but calculation. The air tastes of salt now, from the sweat of fear, as guards in scale armor cataphracts their horses, stamping beyond the walls, shift their spears. Shapur raises a hand, jeweled rings flashing, and the herald's voice booms, taxes doubled loyalty sworn to the fire of Ahura Mazda or face the consequences. Shemዖn meets his eyes. Refusal hangs unspoken a thunderhead over the assembly. The crowd exhales, and with it comes the first metallic bite, the scent of blood from a guard's nicked blade, or perhaps foresight. Shapur takes one look at the bishop's unyielding face and nods once. Chains rattle. What kind of empire demands oaths from the soul itself? Before we go further, I need to be transparent. What you're about to hear involves systematic torture, the kind designed not just to end lives, but to shatter wills across an entire faith community. These details are historically documented, drawn from the Syriac Acts of the Persian martyrs, compiled in the 5th century, corroborated by church historians like Shemዖn and Theodoret, who wrote within a century of the events, and analyzed in modern scholarship such as Sebastian Brock's studies on Sasanian Christianity, and Philip Wood's The Persian Persecution from 2014. But they are deeply disturbing, evoking the machinery of state terror that turns neighbors into informants and faith into felony. If you need to step away, I completely understand. There's no judgment in choosing not to continue. History's weight is not meant for every shoulder at every moment. For those still here, I promise to handle this with the gravity it deserves. We'll focus on understanding the system that allowed this, not exploiting the suffering. These aren't just horror stories. They're warnings about what unchecked suspicion becomes when empires clash and loyalties fracture. This wasn't holy war. This was a machine oiled by imperial ambition, fueled by the friction of borders, and geared to grind dissent into dust. In the shadow of the Tigris, where the Sasanian Empire stretched from the Euphrates to the Indus, Shapur II did not wake one dawn, consumed by divine hatred for the followers of a carpenter from Galilee. No, the edicts that would claim thousands began as ledgers, double taxes to fund catapults against Rome, oaths of allegiance to the eternal fire of Zoroaster. Refusal was not blasphemy at first, it was treason. And in that pivot, an entire network of believers, converts who had whispered psalms in Aramaic for generations, became assets to be audited, threats to be neutralized. The question isn't whether you can handle the truth. It's whether you're willing to remember it not as spectacle, but as blueprint. For in 339, as Constantine's heirs consolidated a Christian Rome, Shapur's Persia saw not rivals in faith, but spies in every cross. The stakes were existential, an empire born of Parthian ashes now facing a Roman colossus that had traded Jupiter for Jesus. Converts, once tolerated as a quirky minority in the bazaars of Ctesiphon, became the fault line. Modern parallels whisper here. Think of how today's regimes tax dissent under guises of security, how borders breed paranoia that devours the innocent. Scholars like Kyle Smith, in his 2016 analysis of Constantine's correspondence, argue this was less religious purge than political prophylaxis, a calculated cull to prevent fifth columns amid war. Yet the body count 16,000 by some tallies in Sozomen's ecclesiastical history defies reduction. This machine didn't invent cruelty, it industrialized it. 5 deliberate phases each targeting a stratum of the Christian edifice clergy, first to decapitate leadership, then provincials to scatter the flock, women next to fracture the hearth, laity after to atomize the community, and finally the holdouts to etch terror into memory. Roman envoys dispatched by Constantius II in 344 carried protests laced with pleas letters preserved in fragments by Ammianus Marcellinus, urging Shapur to spare the sheep of Christ for the sake of peace. But the machine ground on alarming Constantinople not with theology, but with the specter of what Persia might unleash on its own frontiers if faith became weapon. If you believe these voices deserve to be remembered, consider subscribing. Every view helps unearth more from forgotten archives like the Syriac manuscripts resurfacing in Iraqi monasteries today. To understand what happened to those Christian converts, you need to understand the machine that processed them and the man who calibrated its gears. The Sasanian Empire in the 4th century was no fragile theocracy, but a hydraulic beast of administration and arms, its veins the royal road snaking from the Zagros Mountains to the Silk routes beyond. Founded in 224 AD by Ardashir Vasyanam, who toppled the Parthians with a blend of Zoroastrian zeal and pragmatic taxation, it spanned 3 million square kilometers, a mosaic of satrapies where Pahlavi edicts flowed from Ctesiphon like the Tigris itself, swelling in flood-carving canyons and drought. Economically, it thrived on silver mines in the Alborz foothills and date palms along the Shatt al-Arab, but war was its pulse. Rome, that eternal adversary, loomed across the Mesopotamian frontier, its legions probing like fingers into Armenia and Iberia. By 309, when Shapur entered the world, or rather was thrust upon it, the empire teetered on inheritance's knife edge. His father Hormizd II had ruled just 4 years, a king known for his clemency toward nobles, but felled by intrigue, blinded and strangled in his bed, whispers say by courtiers envious of his reforms. The throne gaped empty, and in the vacuum, the high priest of the Magi, those white-robed guardians of fire and orthodoxy, convened the grandees. They turned to the womb, Shapur, unborn son of Hormizd, and a mother of Jewish descent, perhaps a concubine from the Babylonian diaspora. Legend etched in the Shahnameh centuries later claims they crowned the belly itself, diadem slipped over the swell, a ritual to bind the divine spark of kingship before breath. Fact tempers myth. He emerged 40 days after his father's pyre, swaddled in silk, and proclaimed Shapur II, the second of his name, under a regency of uncles and mobeds who ruled through him like puppeteers with a marionette. Those early years forged the boy in isolation's fire. Ctesiphon, the twin city sprawl of Seleucia's Hellenistic ghosts, and Ctesiphon's Sasanian pomp, was his cradle and cage. The palace complex with its iwans of baked brick, arched like welcoming arms, echoed with tutors drilling him in Avestan, hymns and horsemanship on the plains. But Regency-bred resentment, his uncles Hormizd's brothers schemed for the diadem, their factions clashing in shadowed colonnades. By age 5, Shapur had seen his first purge nobles dragged to the royal hunt, not as guests but quarry their blood staining the sands where falcons wheeled. The Magi, ever watchful, instilled doctrine Ahura Mazda's light against Ahriman's chaos, the king as earthly Yazada bridge between flame and firmament. Zoroastrianism wasn't mere piety here. It was protocol, the empire's operating system, taxing temples while exempting firekeepers from corvée. Adolescence brought the Arabs. In 325, as Shapur turned 16 raiders from the Lakhmid client kingdom, nomads with camel-hide tents and curved tulwars swept across the gulf, torching villages in Elimay. The regents thrust him forward a figurehead on a warhorse caparisoned in gold thread, his first beard barely shadowing his jaw. He learned command in the melee cataphracts, charging in thunderous wedges their barded stallions, trampling date groves, arrows whistling like vengeful spirits. Victory at Hajar cemented him, head of the Lakhmid king, paraded on a pike through Ctesiphone's arcades, but it scarred too. Reports from Syriac chroniclers like those in the Chronicle of Arbela note how the boy king wept not for the dead, but for the inefficiency. Why had scouts failed? Why did satraps hoard grain? By 20, the regency dissolved in a coup of his own making. Uncles exiled to Margiana's wastes, their estates confiscated to fund border forts. War with Rome loomed the eternal drumbeat. Constantine, that upstart across the frontier, had pierced Armenia in 297, annexing 5 provinces and crowning Tiridates as puppet. Shapur, now 25, in 334 rebuilt the fleet on the Tigris, commissioning dhows from Indian shipwrights to harry Roman trade. But Constantine's baptism in 337, dying in the Jordan's waters, his empire tilting, Christians shifted the axis. Converts in Persia, long a tolerated underclass, multiplied silk weavers in Gundishapur, chanting vespers, physicians in the royal court, debating Galen over wine. They were assets, once translators bridging Greek and Pahlavi, but now liabilities. Shapur's spies, embedded in bazaars, reported whispers of Roman gold funding churches. The machine stirred edicts from the divan, demanding registers of believers, taxes hiked to equip legions against this new Persian war. He wasn't born to this calculus. Shapur was manufactured layer by layer in the crucible of survival. His mother unnamed in the sources, but evoked in Jewish midrashim as a daughter of exilarchs, taught him resilience in the women's quarters, where eunuchs guarded secrets like incense. She perished young, perhaps in 320, felled by fever sweeping the palace after a monsoon flood. Her funeral pyre, atypical for Zoroastrian queens, blended Babylonian rites with fire, a hybrid that hinted at the fractures he would later seal with iron. By 10, he was the last of his line siblings lost to intrigue or illness. A brother drowned in the royal canal during a hunting accident. Another poisoned at feast, their bodies consigned to the desert without lament. Family of 5 became 3 father, gone before. Sight mother, a fading echo in embroidered tapestries. At 12, the uncle struck Hormizd's brother Narse, plotting from Susa, his agent slipping nightshade into the king's pomegranates. Shapur survived by instinct, vomiting the fruit before scribes, then ordering the plotters flayed alive in the hippodrome, their skins stretched as tent flaps for his pavilion. The act haunted him per sources, like the Karnamag-i Ardashiran, which romanticizes it but notes his pallor, a boy confronting the void left by kin. By 15, the last Uncle Bahram, regent in name, fell to arrows in a staged rebellion, his head spiked on the Madayan bridge. Shapur stood alone, diadem heavy as chains, gazing at the Tigris, where his family's blood had mingled with silt. Psychological fractures spiderwebbed from there. Early portraits etched on rock reliefs at Bishapur show a youth with downcast eyes, shoulders hunched against the weight of prophecy. Tutors remarked his silences, hours staring into fire altars, as if divining not Mazda's will, but his own. The transformation staged in whispers from inquisitive prince devouring Herodotus via Syriac intermediaries to the hunter king who released falcons only to watch them falter. By 25, the boy who pitied Lakhmid widows had hardened into the sovereign who audited souls. A Greek envoy quoted in Ammianus called him a mirror to tyrants, reflective in peace, refractive in war. He wasn't born evil. He was forged in the empire's foundry where loyalty was ledgered and doubt deemed defect. And then everything changed. In 337, as Shapur mustered at the frontier, word arrived Constantine dead, his sons baptizing legions, Armenia's Tiridates raising crosses on Ararat's slopes. The Roman eagle now bore the Chiro. Shapur, in his command tent amid the dust of Nisibis, unrolled the maps, not of terrain, but taxonomy. Christians, how many in each satrapy, who preached without permit. The divan convened under lamplight, flickering like uncertain flames, mobids arguing for purge, viziers for pragmatism. He chose synthesis tax as test, double levies on believers' exemption for apostates. Refusal would reveal the spies. The edict rolled out like a tide scribes on horseback seals of lapis and carnelian stamping parchments from Ctesiphon to Arbela. In the villages of Bet Huzai, deacons burned the notices in church braziers, their smoke curling like prayers unanswered. Shapur watched reports accumulate converts holding firm Roman envoys probing borders. The machine engaged. What began as fiscal friction ignited into inferno. What I'm about to describe isn't random violence, it's a system. 5 distinct acts, each designed to destroy a different part of the human spirit, from hierarchy to hearth, from resistance to remembrance. Documented in the Syriac Acts, these phases unfolded over decades, but their core hammered in the 340s as Shapur's legions clashed with Constantius across the Euphrates. They didn't want martyrs. Martyrs inspire resistance. They wanted ghosts. First came the clergy, the spine of the faith. It started in the sweltering summer of 341, when the Tigris ran low and the air shimmered with heat mirages over the Mesopotamian plain. Seleucia Ctesiphon, that sprawling diadem of the empire, half-Greek agora, half-Zoroastrian ziggurat, buzzed with the harvest's promise, barley carts rumbling through gates flanked by sphinxes, magi chanting vespers as the sun dipped behind the Taki Kisra's unfinished arches. Shapur had returned from skirmishes in Armenia, his armor dented his mood, soured by reports of Christian tax evasion. The royal court teemed satraps in brocade caftans, their beards oiled with rose attar, envoys from Aksum bearing ivory tusks, and the accused herded like sheep to the audience hall's marble floors, cool underfoot despite the blaze outside. Shemʿon bar Sabbaʿe was 47 that year, a man of wiry build and piercing hazel eyes, his hands calloused from binding codices in the scriptorium of Nisibis. Born to Aramaic farmers in the hills of Adiabane, he had risen through vigils and visitations, tending lepers in Gunda Shapur's plague wards before election as Catholicos in 329. He thought of his wife long dead in childbirth, and his daughters now grown weaving in a Beth Lapat convent as guards prodded him forward. Beside him stood his synod 80 bishops in threadbare stoles, deacons like Akba, 32, and broad-shouldered from quarry labor, their faces etched with the quiet defiance of men who had buried friends under Roman edicts decades prior. They smelled of myrrh from morning ablutions, their breath steady with psalms recited under breath. The lead-up stretched like a bowstring. Shapur enthroned on ebony, inlaid with mother-of-pearl, toyed with a pomegranate, its juice staining his fingers crimson. The King of Kings demands tribute for the war against the Frankish dogs, the herald intoned voice echoing off frescoes of triumphant hunts. Believers in the Nazarene will pay double and swear by the fire that sustains the world. Shemዖn stepped forth his sandals, whispering on tile. We render to Caesar what is Caesar's, but to God what is God's. He replied, the words landing like stones in still water. Murmurs rippled. A mobed leaned to whisper, his white turban nodding. Shapur's eyes narrowed, not rage but assessment, like a merchant weighing flawed silk. The act itself blurred into shadow. They led the synod to the riverbank at dusk, where willows wept into the current and the call of ibises pierced the twilight. Chains bound wrists raw, but the implement's bronze collars, weighted rods were arrayed not for spectacle, but efficiency. Hours passed. The men endured their confessions demanded not for truth, but breakage. Shemዖn, last among them, signed nothing. As the moon-crested executioners raised blades under torchlight, flickering on water. One by one, they fell throats-open bodies, consigned to the Tigris's flow, where fish would claim what the current spared. Akba, the youngest deacon, whispered a final oration, before succumbing, his voice steady as the river's rush. When dawn broke, the hall stood empty, save for blood-traced floors scrubbed by slaves. Shemዖn's daughters learned via smuggler's whisper, their convent shutters barred against the night. This wasn't about Shemዖn, the man who baptized border tribes under moonlight. This was about the system, a hierarchy mapped in the royal archives clergy, listed like taxable herds. By targeting the Catholicos and his council, Shapur aimed to orphan the flock, rendering sacraments suspect, without shepherds. The Syriac Acts, compiled from eyewitness affidavits by diarists like Marutha of Mayferkat, detail how this decapitation rippled villages without Eucharist confessions, withheld in fear. Modern analysts like Richard Burgess in his 2006 dissection of martyr chronologies note, the political calculus Constantine's heirs had weaponized bishops as diplomats. Shapur mirrored the move, but inverted. Broader patterns emerge: Zoroastrian orthodoxy, once pluralist under Ardashir, hardened under Moabed influence, viewing crosses as Roman graffiti on Mazda's canvas. Debate swirls in scholarship wood, argues fiscal motive predominated taxes as loyalty litmus, with torture secondary. Yet, Theodoret's ecclesiastical history, drawing from Persian refugees, tallies hundreds in that first wave, their absence hollowing urban churches. Long-term, it frayed the social fabric converts who, apostatized under duress, became informants, their whispers funding more blades. Roman parallels sting things Inquisition in ledgers, or modern asset freezes on dissident clerics. They didn't seek converts' souls, they sought their silence. Ghosts don't preach. And in that void the machine hummed louder, its next gear engaging toward the provinces. But he wasn't finished. As autumn winds stripped the poplars bare in 342, the persecution seeped into the satrapies like dye and wool, staining the hinterlands where faith hid in granary lofts and vineyard presses. Bet Huzaye, that rugged province east of the Diyala hills, terraced with almond orchards, air heavy with the resin of pine, and the distant clamor of iron forges became the second anvil. Shapur, campaigning against Arab raiders in the Gulf marshes, dispatched edicts via couriers on swift Bactrian camels. Root out the Nazarenes, lest they poison the wells of loyalty. The local Marzban, a grizzled veteran named Mihr Narse, enforced with zeal, his scribes tallying resistors like harvest yields. Atsepsimas, bishop of Karka, Bet Slok, was 58, a former fuller, whose hands still bore the scars of dye vats in his youth near the Caspian gates. He had converted at 30, drawn by a wandering deacon's tale of resurrection amid Seleucid ruins, and spent decades mending schisms in mountain hamlets. His flock gathered that October eve in a basilica hewn from limestone, its nave lit by terracotta lamps casting shadows like folded wings. The air tasted of olive oil from the vigil's anointing, mingled with the earthy bite of fresh-dug soil from graves prepared in haste. 38 souls assembled priests in patched dalmatics, deacons like Heliodorus, 29, and lithe from shepherding goats on the slopes, their eyes reflecting the flicker of codices read aloud, passages from Isaiah on suffering servants. Tension coiled slow as a serpent in the underbrush. Mihr Narse's lictors arrived at cock-crow, their hobnailed boots crunching gravel spears, glinting under a mist that clung like regret. They sealed the doors with wax and chain, the bishop's protest a plea for time to disperse the women, and elders met with barked orders in Pahlavi. Inside, the assembly knelt, voices rising in Syriac harmony, the stone walls amplifying their resolve. The Marzban face, scarred from Hunnic skirmishes, inspected them methodically, his fingers tracing crosses on tunics as if appraising flawed gems. "Renounce the corpse god," he growled, breath sour with last night's arak. Atsepsimus met his gaze, quoting the Acts of the Apostles on obedience to higher powers, yet not at soul's cost. The ordeal unfolded in the basilica's crypt, where roots of ancient cedars pierced the vault like veins. Implements arrived in wicker hampers, rods of olive wood collars, forged in the province's smithies. Sessions stretched through the day, the air thickening with the musk of sweat and unspoken pleas. Heliodorus the deacon held longest his recitations unbroken until exhaustion claimed him. They emerged not broken, but unyielding 38 in all, led to the execution scaffold on the village green, where autumn leaves swirled in eddies like discarded prayers. Blades fell in sequence bodies, crumpling into carts bound for unmarked pits, the Tigris waiting to swallow what the earth refused. Mihr Narse reported compliance tallied, but whispers carried the truth to Ctesiphon resistance unbroken relics hidden in ossuaries. This phase revealed the power structure's reach, not just royal fiat, but local satraps, empowered as inquisitors, their quotas of apostasies tied to land grants. Brock's 1982 essay on divided loyalties parses the Act's reliability, embellished dialogues, yes, but core events corroborated by Armenian chronicles, like Faustus of Byzantium, who notes refugee influxes straining Roman borders. It fit broader patterns. Shapur's wars demanded unified fervor, Christianity's pacifism, a perceived sabotage. Modern echoes resound in ethnic purges where provincial governors greenlight atrocities for promotion, Rwanda's Interahamwe, or Syria's Mukhabarat. Scholarly debate tempers the tally. Some, like Joseph Weissehofer, in his Iranica entry, see exaggeration in hagiography. Yet the demographic dip in Christian toponyms post-350 suggests verity. Society reeled orphans apprenticed to magi churches repurposed as granaries, the social weave unraveling as converts fled to Roman Nisibis. He wasn't destroying individuals. He was dissolving the bonds that made faith communal, turning sanctuaries to silence. Ghosts don't gather, and as winter frosts etched the Zagros in silver, the machine turned toward the vulnerable core, the women who wove the faith's quiet threads. What happened next reveals the empire's precision, targeting not warriors, but the nurturers, those whose endurance outlasted steel. In the crisp dawn of 343, as snow dusted the passes of Tur Abdin, the persecution crept into domestic shadows, edicts now demanding veils lifted for inspection of hidden crosses. Arbela, that ancient crossroads nestled in valleys where pomegranates burst like rubies against basalt cliffs, became the stage. The air carried the bite of wood smoke from hearth fires and the faint acrid whiff of sulfur from nearby hot springs, where weary travelers soaked away border woes. Shapur, wintering in his Bishapur palace amid rock reliefs of his forebears, received petitions from mobeds. The women persist, teaching daughters the foreign rites. His reply sealed with the ram's horn sigil, enforce without mercy. Tarbo was 34, a widow of the silk trade, whose looms in Arbela's lower quarter had funded orphanages since her husband's death in a Roman raid a decade prior. Tall and resolute, with hands veined like the roots of her almond tree, she had converted at 18, drawn by a deacon's healing of her fevered child. Her sisters, still living ages 29 and 31, shared her hearth the elder, a scribe copying psalms for illiterate farmers. The younger, a healer blending Greek herbs with Syriac incantations. They gathered that March morning in Tarbo's courtyard, mud brick walls enclosing a garden of mint and myrtle, the women's tunics of undyed wool brushing against rose bushes heavy with dew. Laughter mingled with the clink of teacups, stories of grandchildren scampering in the alleys, plans for Easter baptisms in the Zab River. The intrusion shattered the idyll like frost under boot. Lictors from the city garrison, their cloaks stiff with travel, grime hammered the gate at midday spears, tapping rhythm like impatient fingers. The Marsband's deputy, a functionary named Zeke, with a ledger tucked under arm and coal-rimmed eyes suspicious of every shadow, demanded entry. The King of Kings requires oaths from all under his aegis. He declared, voice flat as the plain beyond. Tarbo faced him at the threshold, her sisters flanking their breaths, quickening with the scent of crushed mint underfoot. Zeke's gaze lingered not lecherous, but ledger-like, noting the absence of fire altars, the faint outline of pectoral crosses beneath wool. Tension built in the courtyard's confines, the sun climbing to bake the earth into a kiln. Zeke paced his boots, grinding gravel, demanding recantation, burn a scripture, swear by the Azada. Tarbo's refusal came soft, laced with invitation, join us in the well of truth, but firm as Arbela's cliffs. The sisters echoed their voices, weaving a tapestry of testimony. Healings witnessed visions and vigils. Zeke made a note quill, scratching parchment like nails on bone, then signaled. Guards seized arms, leading the women not to the square, but a holding cell in the garrison's undercroft, where damp stone wept condensation and the air tasted of mold and despair. There in the gloom, pierced by torch slits, the session commenced. Restraints of leather and iron secured limbs, to walls the weight pulling like gravity's judgment. Hours blurred. The women held their prayers in Syriac, a counterpoint to the interrogator's Pahlavi barbs. Tarbo, enduring longest, emerged with gaze unbroken, whispering amends as they were marched to the execution ground, a barren knoll overlooking the city, where spring grasses whispered secrets to the wind. The sisters fell together, blades swift under a sky streaked with cirrus like faded banners, their forms crumpling into the earth they had tilled. Word spread via peddlers' caravans, reaching Ctesiphon as rumor roam as outrage. This wasn't personal vendetta against Tarbo the Weaver, who mended more than cloth. This was systemic erosion, the hearth as battleground, women as conduits of transmission. By assaulting them, Shapur struck at regeneration. No mothers meant no catechumens, no daughters to inherit the flame. The Acts of Tarbo, preserved in Bejan's 1890 edition, blend hagiography with affidavit miraculous endurance, yes, but grounded in refugee testimonies collated by Bishop Marutha. Sozomen in Book 2 of his history, amplifies the alarm in Constantinople, where Constantius II's court debated intervention envoys carrying tales of sisters slain for syllables. Patterns deepen Zoroastrian gender norms. Confining women to domestic purity clashed with Christianity's egalitarian vespers, making converts suspect vectors. Recent scholarship like Ut Pietrushka's 2018 analysis in the Journal of Persianate Studies debates scale, embellished acts versus sparse Roman dispatches, but the gender pivot is undisputed, mirroring how empires today target female activists to demoralize movements from Iran's hijab protests to Afghanistan's school bans. Society splintered further, families divided, apostate husbands denouncing wives, the weave of kinship frayed to threads. Long-term, it birthed underground networks, women smuggling relics in spindle whorls, but at cost silence sown in nurseries. Ghosts don't nurture. And as summer's heat warped the plains in 344, the machine pivoted to the masses, the laity who peopled the pews. On the third day of that relentless season, as locusts stripped the fields north of the Jabal Hamran, the persecution broadened to the everyday faithful, those whose crosses were etched in calluses rather than codices. Nineveh's ruins looming over Mosul's ford, like the ribs of a fallen Leviathan, framed the frontier's pulse Assyrian ghosts in every tell Roman patrols probing from across the water. The air hummed with cicadas, and the lowing of riverine herds scented with tamarisk sap, and the faint char of boundary beacons. Shapur, fresh from a parley with Constantius's ambassadors, fruitless talks in the shadow of Carrhae, where Crassus' bones still mocked diplomacy, escalated. The dregs must drain, or the wine sours. Narsai, a deacon of 36 from a line of potters in the Nineveh suburbs, embodied the laity's quiet steel. Broad of shoulder from kneading clay at dawn, his fingers bore the ghosts of vessels shaped for church altars, bowls for Eucharist, lamps for vigils. Converted at 15 amid a plague that spared his kin, he had married a weaver, fathered 3 sons, now apprenticed in the guild, and led house churches in the warren of alleys where Aramaic echoed like forgotten hymns. That July eve, as thunderheads bruised the horizon, he hosted a gathering in his terraced home, 20 lay believers ages from 18 to 60, their tunics dusted with kiln ash, sharing flatbread and tales of Julian's apostasy in Rome, hope amid heresy. The raid erupted like a dust devil, tax collectors backed by garrison auxiliaries, their mail hauberks clinking like ill omens, burst through the reed gate at Vesper's torches guttering in the gust. The air shifted bread, turning to ash in mouths, as the lead collector, a Persian named Ardavan, with a ledger bound in goatskin, unfurled the decree. All under the eagle of the sun must abjure the thorn-crowned shade. Narsai rose, his potter's hands open in supplication, recounting provision, from acts sharing all things in common. His wife clutched their youngest, but the focus held on adults. Family's presence underscored the sweep, yet the children's fates, though recorded in the acts as collateral shadows, remain veiled in mercy's curtain, too raw for recounting here. Instead, turned to Narsai 22 years, wet his voice steady as he invoked the Beatitudes. Build-up dragged through the night, the home transformed to holding pen, reed mats rolled aside walls leaning in conspiracy. Ardavin's circled quill, poised demanding signatures on apostasy scrolls, illuminated with fire motifs. Resistance mounted a merchant of 40, bankrupt from double tithes, recited the creed. A widow of 52, healer of border wounds, spat defiance. Sensory strain mounted the itch of straw under restraint. The metallic tang of fierce sweat breaths ragged with restrained sobs. Implements followed at dawn, simple bureaucratic flails of knotted cord presses for limbs, deployed in the courtyard where potted figs witnessed silently. The climax came, piecemeal confessions, coerced not by spectacle, but attrition. Narsai signed nothing, his final prayer, a murmur of clay returning to clay. They processed the group to the ford's edge, where the Tigris lapped hungrily, blades drawn under a sky cracking with lightning. One fell, then another breath, ceasing in ripples forms, yielded to current and pyre. Narsai last his end, a punctuation to the night's litany. Couriers bore the tally to Shapur, compliance at 80%, holdouts erased. This act exposed the system's capillary reach, laity, as the empire's daily pulse, their conformity, the true metric of control. By pulverizing the pews, Shapur aimed to normalize erasure, faith not forbidden, but fatiguing. The Acts of Narsae excerpted in Hoffman's 1880 Auszüge blend oral tradition with detail, verified by Edessa's 411 martyr list in British Library Add. 1250. Ammianus. Marcellinus, in Book 23, notes, Constantius' fury diplomatic rupture legions mobilized alarming Rome with Persia's blueprint for border subversion. Broader contours, economic coercion masked as orthodoxy, double taxes, bankrupting guilds forcing flight or fealty. Contemporary parallels glare North Korea's Songbun system, grading loyalty via daily audits, or China's social credit scoring descent. Debates persist. Driver's 2008 study questions hagiographic inflation. Yet the refugee waves tens of thousands per sozomen attest impact. Society atomized guilds shunned Christian potters, marriages vetoed across lines, the communal loaf crumbled to crumbs. He's not just destroying individuals, he's dissolving the ties that bind, turning fellowship to fracture. Ghosts don't feast together. And as the monsoon swelled the rivers in 345, the final gear locked the holdouts, those embers refusing quenching. While the laity crumbled under summer's hammer, the machine's capstone descended on the unyielding scapes, the remote holdouts who fled to caves and canyons, their persistence a provocation. In the jagged fastness of the Zagros winter, 346 gripped like a vice, winds howling through gorges, where ibex clung to crags, the air sharp with pine resin, and the frozen bite of high altitude. Shapur surveying reliefs at Nakshi Rostam, where ancestors loomed eternal, fumed at reports pockets of believers in Luristan, smuggling scriptures via shepherd trails. His counter-scorched edicts to frontier garrisons, extinguish the sparks ere they kindle. Mar Bassus abbot of a hermitage near Bisotun was 62, his frame gaunt from 40 years of ascetic bread and water beard, white as the snowcaps. A former soldier converted in Armenian captivity, he had founded the enclave at 40, drawing wanderers, disciples like Yusuf. 28 and sinewy from wood hewing, his tattoos faded scars from a youth in the cataphract lines. They huddled that January in rock-hewn cells, walls weeping ice, the scent of tallow candles mingling with herbal poultices for frostbitten feet. Vespers echoed softly psalms on endurance bread, broken in the grotto's nave, where Darius's inscriptions mocked from above. Intruders scaled the passes at Blizzard's edge, a detachment of hill tribesmen allied to the crown, their felt boots muffling steps on scree. The commander, a Kurdish chieftain named Bahram with a torque of twisted gold, bore torches that spat embers into the gale. The light of Mazda claims all shadows, he bellowed, wind-whipping his fur cloak. Mar Bassus emerged from the chapel cleft, crozier and hand-gnarled olive wood from Jordan groves, offering salt as guest right. Bahram refused, eyes scanning the hermits, 18 souls ages, spanning youth to elder, their tunics patched with goat hide. Families had sought refuge here too, but the young one's trials shadowed in the records draw a veil. Dwell instead on Yusuf, deserter turned disciple, his resolve forged in desertion's regret. The standoff stretched through the squall cave mouths flaring with intruder flames. Bahram demanded abjuration, desecrate a relic, hail the Amisha Spentus. Mar Bassus countered with parable, the prodigal's return, mercy's measure. Tension peaked as night deepened, winds moaning like unshriven shades. The hermits chained loosely to boulders, breaths clouding in cold that clawed lungs. Implements crude mountain-forged thongs, studded with flint presses of yew, deployed in the open, where stars wheeled indifferent. Endurance tested not flesh alone, but fraternity. Yusuf recited creeds till voice cracked the abbot's silence a sermon. Dawn's pallor revealed the toll, holdouts led to a crevasse edge, where the abyss yawned like judgment. Blades whispered finality forms, toppling into white silence, the wind claiming echoes. Mar Bassus last his fall, a feather in the gale. Tribesmen descended cells razed to rubble. This capstone unveiled the system's totality, no refuge, absolute faith's fringes, as fatal as its core. By pursuing hermits, Shapur sought to cauterize memory, itself isolates who preserved lore in oral chains. The Acts of Mar Bassus and Braun's 1915 act-infused legend with log miracles tempered by geographic fidelity echoed in Faustus's Armenian annals. Constantius' 347 missive fragmentary and Eusebius's continuators decries the mountain massacres straining the fragile peace. Patterns culminate from fiscal probe to existential hunt. Zoroastrian universalism inverted to exclusion, modern lenses. Taliban's cave raids or Soviet gulags for dissident monks illuminate the psychology. Isolation amplifies terror, turning sanctuary to snare. Wiesehofer contests ubiquity, positing localized flares, but the martyr diaspora cells in Edessa swelling bears witness. Society's remnants, oral traditions, warped alliances forged in exile, the empire's fabric pocked with voids. They wanted ghosts, but embers smolder, and in that miscalculation the machine faltered. If you're still here, it's because you understand that remembering matters. What comes next is harder, the fracture that exposed the gears. You can stop anytime, but for those continuing, let's see this through together. While Shapur was destroying holdouts in the heights, he made one crucial error, underestimating the border's bleed, where Persian refugees swelled Roman ranks, turning persecution into propaganda. The conspiracy brewed not in palaces, but frontier outposts. Conspirators, a mosaic of defectors, Armenian nobles like Vardan Mamikonian, chafing under Sasanian suzerainty, Syriac traders smuggling martyr relics for Constantius' court, and Zoroastrian defectors, Moabids disillusioned by the purge's excess, whispering of Ahriman's overreach in fire temples. Their motivations layered. Vardan sought autonomy for his highlands, where crosses now outnumbered flames. Traders eyed Roman tariffs on silk. Moabids, per Brock's analysis, feared the faith's viral spread would eclipse Mazda's light entirely. Numbering perhaps 200 by 350, they coordinated via carrier pigeons from Nisibis codes etched in wax-sealed scrolls, psalms masking muster points. The plot unfolded in shadows, initial probes in 348 Roman legions, feinting at Singara to draw Shapur east, while saboteurs torched granaries and media. Shapur countered with purges, but the net slipped. Constantius envoys bearing gifts of Cappadocian horses sowed doubt with tales of Persian martyrs venerated in Antioch. By 353, as Shapur besieged Amida, the conspiracy-crested Vardan's riders infiltrated supply lines, poisoning wells with aconite, their daggers silencing quartermasters. Whispers reached Ctesiphon treason in the ranks, fueled by the very ghosts Shapur sought to bury. He aimed his cruelty at the wrong frontier, the living border where loyalty was as fluid as the Euphrates in flood. Present tense grips now, 359. The dust of Ctesiphon stirs under a sirocco that blinds and bites. Shapur, aged 50, his diadem, dented from a recent sally, convenes the divan in the great Iwan banners of lions limp in the heat. Reports flood Armenian revolt, Roman bribes to satraps' churches rising from raised foundations, like weeds through cracks. A mobed throat bobbing stammers of omens eclipses comets tailing like accusations. Shapur rises fist clenched on the throne's arm veins, bulging like Tigris tributaries. The Nazarenes multiply as vermin. He snarls, voice echoing off tile mosaics of cosmic battles. Orders cascade triple garrisons inquisitors to every village. But the machine seizes. That night, as lamps gutter in the harem, a servant bribed by Vardan's gold slips nightshade into the king's wine. Shapur convulses attendants, scattering like leaves. Physicians summon, but the venom races, breath ragged limbs twitching in the silk sheets. Dawn finds him still, the diadem askew, empire holding breath. No blade, no spectacle, just quiet unraveling the body, betraying the sovereign who bent others to will. Aftermath erupted like a breached dam. Conspirators scattered Vardan, crowned in Echmiadzin, his realm a Christian bulwark till 451. Roman envoys under Jovian in 363 bartered peace at Dura, ceding Nisibis, but gaining martyr veneration rights. Shapur's sons, Hormizd III. Then Shapur III ascended amid purges. Moabids, scapegoated, their temples audited for laxity. Chaos reigned, satrapies rebelled from Bactria to Bahrain. Taxes evaded, legions mutinied over unpaid grain. Thousands perished in the power vacuum, nobles beheaded in Ctesiphon squares, refugees clogging roads to the Gulf. Constantius, learning via swift galleys, proclaimed it divine justice in edicts read from Edessa's walls. This is what happens when the machine breaks. It devours everything, not just the tyrant, but the edifice he rode. The system survived, reshaped under Yazdegerd I's tolerance in 399, but scarred Christianity burrowed deeper, its roots fed by the blood Shapur spilled. The blueprint endured, etched in annals from Baghdad to Byzantium, a warning that empires built on suspicion sow their own unraveling. The chroniclers recorded it piecemeal, but the true discovery came buried in time's strata, a revelation that bridged the chasm. In 1905, amidst the Ottoman Empire's twilight, a team of French archaeologists led by Father Jean-Baptiste Chabot, a Jesuit with ink-stained fingers and a penchant for Syriac palimpsests, sifted the sands of Tur Abdin, those Mesopotamian plateaus where monasteries clung like barnacles to cliffs. The air was thick with thyme and goat bells, the dig site a scar of turned earth under a sky vast as forgotten prayers. Shapur II, and sun-leathered from prior treks to Palmyra, knelt in the dust of Deir al-Zafaran's undercroft, his trowel scraping parchment fragments from a sealed jar, once oil, now oracle. What emerged stunned leaves of the Acts of the Persian martyrs, carbon-dated via early radiometric assays to the late 4th century, their ink faded but defiant. Passages on Shemዖn's stand. Tarbo's trial detailed not in hagiographic flourish, but stark affidavit names, dates the Tigris's very bends as witnesses. Chabot felt it viscerally a chill, despite the heat, as if the jar's seal had trapped echoes of Aramaic defiance. Published in 1908 by the Académie des Inscriptions, the fine corroborated Sozomen's tallies, filling gaps in Bejan's editions, with eyewitness granularity a Sepsima's exact refusal, Narsai's final psalm. Why it matters pierces the veil of centuries. This wasn't about dusty relics. It's about power's attempt at erasure and refusal's quiet roar. In an age of algorithms auditing belief from Xinjiang's re-education camps to digital fatwas, Shapur's machine feels eerily current surveillance as sacrament descent double-taxed into silence. Psychologically, it unveils the pathology of suspicion, how leaders forged in Regency's Forge Project isolation onto subjects turning faith to felony. Remembering teaches resilience. Converts didn't triumph in life, but in legacy. Their acts seeding the Church of the East that spanned to China by 600. Parallels proliferate. Constantius's pleas mirror UN resolutions on Rohingya. The Zagros holdouts evoke Kurdish Peshmerga in caves. It redefines victory. They didn't live to see Yazdegerd's edict of tolerance, but they left scars on the system, fissures widened by time. The empire crumbled in 651 to Arab caliphs, but 18 women with psalms unbroken, they outlasted thrones. Think on that. History's victors write annals, but survivors script eternity. It's not about religion. It's about what power does when it tries to erase people, and what happens when they refuse to disappear. Shemዖn bar Sabbaʿe and his synod were meant to dissolve into the Tigris, just as Tarbo's sisters were to fade into Arbela's winds. Narsai's voice silenced in Nineveh's ford, Mar Bassus's embers quenched in Zagros snows. That was the plan, the machine's elegant efficiency turning thousands into footnotes, their crosses melted for coin, their graves sown with salt. But they didn't disappear. They're still here. In the acts unearthed at Tur Abdin, their words preserved like amber, defying the damp that claimed so many codices. In the rock reliefs at Taki Bostan, where Shapur's successors carved triumphs that dare not mention the ghosts haunting their flanks. In the ground, archaeologists excavated in 1970s Iraq church foundations at Hira, layered with ash from 340s pyres. Carbon traces yielding to spectrometers that whisper dates unassailable. And now they're here with you, here. Because you chose to listen, because you chose to remember, because you refused to let their silence be the final word. Lata d'Maran de Alman, the suffering of our Lord of the Worlds, as Shemዖn phrased it in his last oration, preserved in Syriac script that bends but never breaks. Translation, the suffering of our Lord of the Worlds. You're not just a reader, you're a witness. And witnesses are how the past stays alive, how the erased etch themselves indelible. To witness is to bear the weight without buckling, to let their defiance echo in your own doubts about borders that breed beasts, about faiths taxed into famine, about powers that protocol pain. These stories matter because they map the machinery we still oil, surveillance states scoring, souls regimes, rebranding purge as protection, the slow grind of suspicion, eroding empathy. We owe the past not pity, but partnership, amplifying the Aramaic whispers that Rome amplified into alarm, that Constantinople turned to creed. In a world where Constantius's envoys find echoes in amnesty cables, their refusal reminds us erasure fails when memory militates. What we owe them is vigilance, the audit of our own ledgers, questioning when taxes target belief, when oaths demand the soul's surrender. Connected to today, Persia's heirs in Tehran still navigate Mazda's shadow, Christians a minority navigating double measures. Across the Gulf, Yemen's converts face fifth column slurs amid war. These narratives forge bridges from 339 to now urging us to dismantle machines before they calibrate. Their victory wasn't survival, but sedimentation, layering resilience into history's bedrock, so that when tyrants rise, we recognize the gears. If this story moved you, if it reminded you why remembering matters, leave a comment below. Tell me what struck you. Shemዖn's gaze across the throne room, Tarbo's unyielding loom, the Zagros wind carrying unshriven prayers. Share what you're thinking. Ask your questions about the act's authenticity, Constantius's unread letters, the women whose names archaeology is only now unearthing. Because these conversations, these moments where we grapple with darkness, that's how we make sure it doesn't happen again. How we honor the ghosts by giving them voice. If you believe voices like theirs deserve to be heard, subscribe. Not for me, but for every silence that still needs to be broken. For every story still buried under Mesopotamian tells. For every voice that was meant to disappear, but refuses to stay gone. Shapur ruled for 70 years, built a system that showed every future Shah how to tax the spirit into submission. And the blueprint never disappeared. But neither did Shemዖn's refusal.